Welcome to part 2 of A Journey Remembered. A storm was brewing over the islands of St. Kitts, Nevis, and Anguilla, as Anguillans and Nevisians were not keen about going into the statehood agreement. Their objections were rooted in history. Hurricanes, drought, and famine had ravished Anguilla between 1822 and 1825. In 1825, London instructed Governor Maxwell to effect a union between St. Kitts and Anguilla. The island was to send a representative to the House of Assembly in Basseterre, which was made responsible for restoring order and passing necessary legislation. It was felt that St. Kitts's sugar industry would carry the tiny island, which was dependent on cotton, fishing, and salt. Similarly, throughout the 19th century, less successful attempts were made to amalgamate the administration of Nevis to St. Kitts, its sugar industry in difficulties. These efforts were finally successful in 1882. Soon after the mainstay of the St. Kitts economy went into a deep depression, government projects were abandoned, including the building of hotels and a school designed to improve the trades on the island. The Treasury building was completed by the appropriation of funds meant to finance immigration to St. Kitts. The sugar industry in St. Kitts had some good years in the 20th century, but these were not long-lasting, and its decline meant that the revenue could not meet expectations in St. Kitts and still less in Nevis and Anguilla. As statehood approached, Nevisians and Anguillians could only express frustration at the lack of development on their islands, and for this they blamed Basseterre, and thoughts of separation abounded. In 1967, the memory of the failure of federation was very vivid. Premier Robert Bradshaw, who saw strength in numbers and had supported the federation wholeheartedly, could not stomach further fragmentation. But neither could he overcome the sense in the two sister islands that they had been neglected. They saw local government as a way to deal with the abandonment they had been feeling over the years. The issue of local government came up at the conference in London, and special provision was made, but the actual form that it would take was to be settled by Parliament. London sent a local government expert to the territory. In preparation for his arrival, Bradshaw appointed a committee to present him with concrete proposals. Peter Adams, the representative for Anguilla, was a member of this committee. However, in the villages of that island, Ronald Webster, John Rogers, and Atlin Harrigan carried the message that St. Kitts had no regard for Anguilla and that Anguillians could expect nothing but more taxes after statehood.
Neglect was one issue. Neglect. Now, there are various interpretations about what was happening at that time and as to what was the meaning of statements made about whether the bones were in rice or pepper in the soup. And your interpretation of what is said would depend perhaps on your perspective and your area of support. But suffice it to say that in Nevis and in Anguilla, the universal feeling was that they were being neglected. Take the question, in both islands, in Anguilla, for example, there was no electricity, no central electricity at all. There was no central water supply at all. I recall, and I think I'm going to make a comment about it. I recall one bit of paved road in Anguilla in 1964. Well, significantly before the statehood. Nevis, a serious water problem, right? A water problem which was more serious than seasonal droughts could account for, right? And the perception there was, in fact, the knowledge there was that they were dependent on wells throughout this Nevis, and that many of much of the machinery which was responsible for would not be maintained. The machinery to the pumps which was scattered throughout the various places and it were not being maintained.
The months leading up to statehood saw some of the most vehement opposition ever staged. British government experts were expelled, political rallies sabotaged, and there was violent disruption at the State Queen Show, an event organized by the government in St. Kitts to celebrate the creation of the new state.
The breakdown started when a beauty pageant was to be held in Anguilla. And several persons from here, Cromwell Bory as a dramatist, and Tunka Abdul Rama as a magician and dancer and so on, all went down to Anguilla for the beauty. But the Anguillans had other things in mind. Before that, we knew from the political platforms and so on, people who spoke about what was happening in Anguilla. That Anguilla will never join St. Kitts unless St. Kitts agreed to a 9-point plan that they had put up, and they had the assistance of a famous lawyer in St. Kitts, and who was in opposition to Robert Bradshaw. And they felt as though the whole development, people felt as though the whole development of this anti-St. Kitts thing stemmed from the presence of this lawyer who then lived in Anguilla. There were books written about it afterward, and Anguilla's Battle for Freedom by Harrigan and some other name, and it spells out what took place in Anguilla, how they attacked the place where the show was to be held, how Tunka ran and hid in the nearby cemetery in a grave, the grave that was dug. He went down and some lady tripped and fell in and shouted, "Where am I?" And Tunka said, "You are in heaven, darling." Of course, that was the humor of the whole thing. But I mean, it was a scary situation. People had to run for their lives and so on. And so, as the book speaks to it, it says that was the beginning of the revolution. And it ended when the Anguillans decided to come to St. Kitts and do a number of things. They attacked the police station, they attacked the Defense Force headquarters, they attacked the power station. And, it all went to naught because there were some brave people who stood up when the guns were firing, and it all went to naught. So that was the failure of the attack on St. Kitts.
Anguilla's protest against statehood found an ally in St. Kitts. The newly formed People's Action Movement adopted the cause. The party had contested elections in 1966, and although it did not win any seats in St. Kitts, the results scored by its candidates, particularly Kennedy Simmons and William Herbert, showed that this new opposition had staying power. In February 1967, Herbert of St. Kitts and Adams of Anguilla presented the governor, Sir Fred Phillips, with their 9-point plan, which demanded the setting up of full local elected island council with responsibility of roads, water, electricity, and land, and a say in the development of the island. They also wanted that the chair of the council to be selected by it and to ensure that the government in Basseterre could not abolish or suspend it. Governor Phillips informed them that all these points had been covered by the report of the local government expert, which he had just received and was about to forward to the chief minister. Despite this, Herbert and Adams departed for London to make their case before the Minister of State. However, on the 22nd of February 1967, the Queen in Council passed the Associated Statehood Constitution that mandated that all members of Council be nominated until the 1st January 1968.
So the 1967 Constitution, by its very design, it had problems in it. And then for us, in St. Kitts and Nevis, I'm not talking of the other islands now, the fact that Anguilla decided that they are not going to go along with the 19 67 Constitution, it created additional problems for us here in St. Kitts and Nevis.
Statehood came into being on February 27, 1967. At the insistence of Premier Bradshaw, the territory, which was the first colonized, became the first to transition into the new constitution. In 1967, the territory of St. Christopher, Nevis and Anguilla was granted full internal autonomy as an associated state of the United Kingdom.
The transition was to try to see if one could give as full a measure of independence as possible. So this was saying that you had full internal self-government, and all that you left for the UK, for Britain to do, was defense and foreign affairs. And so you were fully sovereign, in a sense, within your own structure. You moved from an administrator that you had in the colonial days or the pre-statehood days to a governor. And the first governor was, of course, Sir Fred Phillips, who was written intensely and extensively on federal structures and about the Federation and everything else, because he was the cabinet secretary in the West Indies Federation, and he was brought by Mr. Bradshaw to be our last administrator, and then to lead into statehood as our first governor.
Instead of celebrations, Anguilla moved towards secession. The provisional government organized an internal referendum on the matter. The overwhelming result was 1,813 votes in favor and 5 against, out of 2,554 registered voters. Remarkably, Anguilla's purpose was to secede from St. Kitts in order not to declare independence, but to return to the fold of colonialism through direct association within the Great Britain. Constitutionally, however, Britain could not interfere with the internal affairs of St. Kitts Nevis and Anguilla. The situation in Anguilla became chaotic. Anguillian historians Colville Petty and Nat Hodge noted that, fearing an invasion, Ronald Webster and a lawyer from St. Kitts prepared a preemptive strike. The volunteers were given the impression that Kittitians would meet them and be happy to help them get rid of Bradshaw and his regime. But the Anguillians and the American mercenaries who accompanied them arrived in St. Kitts late on the 10th June 1967 and found only a small group of men. The botched attack sent Premier Bradshaw into bunker mode. Numerous people were arrested or declared persona non grata in the days that followed. Defense Force personnel was stationed in Nevis. According to Vincent Hubbard, at one point a lorry was commandeered and troops drove around the island, firing off rifles in the air at every village they passed through. Armed soldiers were also on the ferry, and yet, by the end of that month, Bradshaw sat in a meeting with Anguillians, chaired by Sir Fred Phillips. According to the governor, the premier showed a distinct attitude towards compromise. By comparison, Nevis's approach to the whole issue of its internal administration and its relationship with St. Kitts was sedate and law-abiding. Talk of secession had surfaced in the early 1960s. Eugene Walwyn and Wilmoth Nichols had won seats in Nevis in the territory's general election of 1957. Walwyn was then given a place in the Executive Council, but fell out with the Labour administration over what he could divulge to his fellow Nevisian representative. Eventually, they created the United Nevis Movement, which took a pro-secession stand. Then in 1966, having won his seat for the third time in a row, Bradshaw offered Walwyn the post of Attorney General in St. Kitts. Bradshaw was astute enough to know that sometimes ground could be gained by rewarding a foe. This was not the first time that he had used this tactic. Walwyn, who had to have seen this as a career move for himself, also felt that this was an opportunity to work within the administration for his island. Many Nevisians saw his move as a betrayal and were stunned into silence. Following the celebration of statehood, the first local council for Nevis was sworn in at the courthouse on Charlestown on the 20th April 1967. All of its 9 members were nominated by the Premier, as provided for by the order in council. Eventually, the Local Council Act was passed, giving Nevis a council with more authority and consisting of a majority of elected members. The first election took place on the 15th December 1967. Most of the seats were won by Nevisians who supported the People's Action Movement. Secession took center stage again in 1971. The sinking of the ferry Christina on the 1st August 1970 devastated Nevisians, and once again the anger of the population was focused on Bradshaw and his administration. It found political expression in the creation of the Nevis Reformation Party under the leadership of Simeon Daniel and Ivor Stevens. Their manifesto consisted of one item: secession of Nevis from St. Kitts at all costs. This was to be the tone of inter-island politics for the next 9 years. With Anguilla de facto out of the picture, the political arena became a long-standing feud over what was to become of Nevis when the two islands started negotiating their independence from Britain. It would take 12 more years, the death of two premiers, and an unimagined and unprecedented coalition between the People's Action Movement and the Nevis Reformation Party for the two islands, and the spectre of succession enshrined in the Constitution to move forward into independence. However, the years in between statehood and independence were marked by the development of infrastructure, the creation of a social safety net, capacity building in education, the blossoming of cultural expression, and of course, growing political differences. Next time on A Journey Remembered.
Statehood has come, and the job of my government and people like myself is to lay a sound foundation and to do a bit of the superstructural building. You will come along later and finish the job. The future belongs to you, the children of this country, our children. We are doing the job of the present, making it possible for the future to have meaning.